The underground chamber shook violently as another plasma bombardment struck the surface above. Dust rained down from the reinforced ceiling, while emergency lights flickered in the smoky air. High Counselor Lyra pressed her scaled hands against the communication console, her normally calm demeanor cracking under the weight of her species' imminent extinction. 3 days ago, the Vorthan Empire had arrived in their star system with a fleet that blotted out the stars. The elegant spires of Thessia Prime's great cities now lay in ruins, their crystalline towers reduced to glowing slag. Millions of Althari civilians had perished in the opening hours of the attack, vaporized by weapons that turned matter itself into energy. "Counselor, the northern districts have gone silent," reported tech specialist Dern, his voice hollow with despair. "The emergency shelter's there. They're not responding to our signals." Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 5 billion souls depending on her next decision. The Althari had always been a peaceful species, their technology focused on art, science, and harmony with their world. They had no weapons that could challenge the Vorthan war machines, no soldiers trained in the brutal art of combat. Their ships were exploration vessels, not instruments of war. The command center's main screen displayed the tactical situation in stark, horrifying detail. Red markers showed Vorthan positions across their world, while the few remaining blue dots representing Althari resistance pockets grew smaller by the hour. In orbit, the enemy fleet maintained its blockade, systematically destroying anything that moved. "Why are they doing this to us?" whispered Communications Officer Vel, tears streaming down her face. "We offered them our research, our resources, everything they wanted. Why must they kill us all?" Lyra had asked herself the same question countless times since the attack began. The Vorthan Empire's demand had been simple: complete surrender and enslavement of their entire species. When the Althari Council had refused, explaining that their people would rather die free than live as slaves, the Vorthans had simply shrugged and begun the extermination. Another tremor shook the facility, stronger this time. Somewhere above them, the ancient forests of Thessia Prime burned under directed energy weapons. The air recycling systems struggled to filter out the toxic smoke that seeped through even their deepest bunkers. They had perhaps hours before this. Shelter 2 would be discovered and destroyed. "There is one option left," Lyra said quietly, her words carrying across the silent command center. Every surviving member of the Althari government turned to look at her, hope and desperation mingling in their expressions. She moved to a secured terminal at the far end of the room, one that had remained locked since the beginning of their civilization's membership in the Galactic Council. Her fingers trembled as she entered the ancient access codes, sequences that had been passed down through generations of leaders, but never used. "The Deathworld Protocol," she whispered, and several gasps echoed through the chamber. Every spacefaring civilization knew the legends. Somewhere in the galaxy existed worlds so hostile that they had forged their inhabitants into something beyond normal evolution. The stories spoke of creatures that thrived in environments that would kill other species in minutes, beings that had learned to wage war with a ferocity that terrified even the most aggressive empires. Most scholars dismissed these tales as myths, elaborate stories told to frighten children or explain unusual phenomena. But the Galactic Council maintained the emergency protocols nonetheless, ancient communication frequencies that supposedly could reach these mythical Deathworlders in times of absolute desperation. "Counselor, you cannot be serious," protested Defense Coordinator Kess. "Those are fairy tales. Even if such beings exist, why would they help us? They would be as likely to destroy us themselves." Lyra's hands moved across the console with growing certainty. "Because we have nothing left to lose. Our children are dying above us. Our world burns. If we do nothing, the Althari cease to exist within days. But if there is even the smallest chance that someone out there might answer our call..." The long-range communication array powered up with a deep thrum that resonated through the shelter's walls. This was their most powerful transmitter, designed to send messages across galactic distances. Now it would broadcast their desperate plea into the unknown, hoping against hope that someone would hear and care enough to respond. "What do we tell them?" asked Vel, her voice barely audible above the mounting energy discharge. Lyra thought of her daughter, somewhere in the ruins above, probably dead already. She thought of the great libraries burning, the research stations reduced to craters, the peaceful gardens where her people had walked for thousands of years, now nothing but radioactive wasteland. "We tell them the truth," she said firmly, "that we are a dying species, that we have tried to live in peace but found only war, that we ask not for conquest or revenge, but simply for the chance to survive, that we will remember anyone who helps us until the last Althari draws breath." Her fingers moved across the controls, encoding their message in the ancient formats specified by the Deathworld protocol. The signal would carry their language matrices, their location, the tactical situation, and most importantly, their plea for help. It would be broadcast on frequencies that supposedly could reach across the galaxy to worlds where evolution had created something terrible and wonderful. The transmission began, sending their desperate cry toward a blue world in the Sol system, where humanity had spent countless millennia learning to survive on a planet that actively tried to kill them. The message traveled through subspace at velocities beyond light, carrying with it the hope of an entire dying civilization. As the signal departed, another massive explosion rocked the shelter. The lights went out completely for several seconds, before the backup systems engaged. When illumination returned, half the command staff was bleeding from debris wounds, and several control stations had been destroyed. "How long until they find us?" Lyra asked quietly. 6 hours, Dern replied, checking his instruments. "Maybe 8, if we're fortunate." Lyra nodded and settled into her command chair, watching the communication board that showed their message, racing toward the unknown. Either their call would reach someone who cared enough to help, or the Althari would join the countless other species that had simply vanished from galactic history. Above them, the bombardment continued, and Thessia Prime died by degrees while its people waited for a miracle from the stars. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Admiral Brooks continued sipping it anyway as he studied the alien transmission for the 100th time. The message had arrived at Luna Command through channels that most of humanity's military leadership hadn't even known existed, ancient protocols buried deep in their first contact databases. The holographic display showed him everything: the burning world of Thessia Prime, the desperate faces of the Althari leaders, and the tactical readouts of the Vorthan fleet currently engaged in systematic genocide. What struck him most wasn't the advanced technology or the scale of destruction, but the simple, heartbreaking plea in the aliens' voices. They weren't asking for conquest or revenge. They just wanted to live. "Sir, the Joint Chiefs are assembled," announced his aide, Lieutenant Rodriguez. The young officer had been working without sleep since the transmission arrived, coordinating responses across Earth's military infrastructure. Brooks nodded and made his way to the secure conference room where Earth's military leadership waited. The faces around the table represented every nation and space-based command structure that humanity had built during their expansion into the solar system. These were people who had spent their careers preparing for threats from their own species, not for alien wars on the other side of the galaxy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brooks began, activating the central display, "6 hours ago we received a distress call from a species called the Althari. They are being exterminated by something called the Vorthan Empire, and they have specifically requested aid from what they call Deathworlders." General Murphy, commander of the Colonial Marine Corps, leaned forward in her chair. Her weathered face bore scars from conflicts on Mars and the asteroid mining stations, places where humans had learned to fight in environments that would kill most Earth-born creatures instantly. "Why us?" she asked bluntly. What makes them think we can help when their own military apparently can't handle this threat? Because we evolved on Earth, replied Dr. Watson, the xenobiology specialist who had been analyzing the alien data. Look at these readings from their homeworld. Thessia Prime has a stable climate, no major predators, minimal disease pressure, and abundant resources. It's essentially a paradise world. The Althari never needed to become warriors, because their environment never forced them to adapt for survival. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Earth, by contrast, had been trying to kill its inhabitants since life first crawled out of the primordial oceans. Humans had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, and countless species that viewed them as food. Every technological advance, from fire to nuclear weapons, had been driven by the need to survive in a hostile environment. Their attackers, the Vorthans, are apparently a typical aggressive species, Watson continued. They have energy shields, plasma weapons, and tactics based on technological superiority. But their approach to warfare is civilized. They fight at long range, with clean kills and minimal collateral damage to their own forces. Colonel Park, head of Naval Intelligence, brought up the tactical displays. Their fleet composition suggests they're used to fighting other species with similar technology levels. Energy-based weapons, defensive shields, elegant ship designs optimized for space combat between equals. And we fight dirty, Murphy said with a grim smile. We use kinetic weapons because we learned to throw rocks at mammoths. We armor our ships like tanks because we had to survive everything from spears to nuclear bombs. We don't retreat because retreating on Earth meant getting eaten. Brooks watched the faces around the table as understanding dawned. Humanity had never been the strongest or fastest species on their homeworld, but they had become the most adaptable and persistent. When facing a saber-toothed cat, early humans hadn't developed bigger claws. They had learned to work together, use tools, and never give up until the threat was eliminated. The question, Brooks said quietly, is whether we're willing to risk human lives for aliens we've never met. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours. Some argued that humanity couldn't afford to involve itself in galactic politics, that their responsibility was to their own species first. Others pointed out that the Vorthan Empire might eventually pose a threat to Earth if left unchecked, but it was General Murphy who ended the discussion with a simple observation. We're not doing this because it's smart or safe or profitable. We're doing it because someone asked for help, and we're the only ones who can provide it. That's what humans do. The vote was unanimous. Within 6 hours, Earth's 3rd Expeditionary Fleet was being prepared for immediate departure. The fleet had been designed for deep space operations against unknown threats. Its ships built with the brutal efficiency that characterized all human military technology. Captain Torres received her orders while the Valiant was undergoing routine maintenance at the Mars shipyards. Her dreadnought was one of humanity's newest designs, a kilometer-long monster armed with railgun batteries that could punch through asteroids and missile systems designed to saturate entire sectors of space with nuclear fire. "How long until we can depart?" she asked her chief engineer, Commander Blake. 18 hours if we skip the diagnostic protocols, Blake replied. But Admiral Brooks wants us moving in 12. Then we skip the diagnostics, Torres said without hesitation. If those people are dying while we run system checks, we'll never forgive ourselves. Across the solar system, similar scenes played out as the human military machine mobilized with terrifying efficiency. Marines loaded onto assault, transports, their equipment designed for fighting in environments ranging from airless moons to gas-giant atmospheres. Supply ships filled their holds with ammunition, medical supplies, and the thousands of spare parts needed to keep human technology functioning far from Earth's industrial base. The alien message had triggered something deep in humanity's evolutionary programming. For millions of years, humans had survived by forming groups, by protecting the weak, and by facing threats with coordinated aggression. The Althari distress call hadn't just requested military aid. It had activated every protective instinct that had allowed humanity to climb from prey species to apex predator. As the fleet prepared to depart, news of the mission spread through Earth's communication networks. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Civilian corporations offered free supplies and equipment. Retired military personnel volunteered to return to active duty. Children sent drawings and messages of encouragement to the crews preparing to fight for aliens they had never seen. In the final hours before departure, Admiral Brooks stood on the observation deck of Luna Command, watching the fleet assemble in Earth's orbit. Hundreds of ships, from massive dreadnoughts to small escort vessels, formed into battle formations that had been tested in countless simulations but never used in real combat. The Althari had called for help from the Deathworlders, and humanity was about to show the galaxy what evolution on a world that never stopped trying to kill you could produce. The fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and disappeared into hyperspace, carrying with them the hopes of a dying species and the fury of Earth's children. Commander Thane had been born into war. His earliest memories were of plasma fire lighting up the void between worlds as the Vorthan Empire expanded across the galaxy. He had commanded fleets in a dozen campaigns of conquest, watching inferior species crumble before the might of superior technology and tactical doctrine. The bridge of his flagship Dominion hummed with quiet efficiency as his crew monitored the final stages of the Thessia Prime operation. The Althari resistance had collapsed, faster than expected, their peaceful nature making them unable to adapt to the realities of total war. Within days, another world would join the growing list of Vorthan conquests. "Sir, we're detecting hyperspace emergent signatures at the system's edge," reported his sensor operator, a young female named Des, who had earned her position through excellence in previous campaigns. Thane barely glanced at the displays. "Althari reinforcements? Negative, sir. The signatures don't match any known Althari vessel types. Configuration unknown, approaching at standard diplomatic velocity." "Refugees, then," Thane dismissed. "Some neighboring species evacuating their own civilians before we expand operations. Let them watch what happens to those who resist the Empire." But as the unknown vessels fully emerged from hyperspace, Thane felt the first stirring of unease. The ships that materialized on his sensors were unlike anything in his tactical databases. They were crude, angular things that looked more like flying fortresses than proper spacecraft. Their hulls bristled with weapon emplacements, but the energy signatures were all wrong. "Sir, I'm not detecting any shield generators on those vessels," Des reported, confusion clear in her voice. "They appear to be using pure armor plating for protection." Thane leaned forward in his command chair, studying the tactical display with growing interest. The unknown ships numbered perhaps 50 vessels, far too few to challenge his fleet of 300. Their approach vector was direct and aggressive, showing no signs of the caution that marked civilized warfare. "Communications. Are they responding to our standard challenge frequencies?" "Negative, sir. They're broadcasting on primitive radio waves. The message is—" His communications officer paused, consulting his translation matrix. "They identify themselves as the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet of the Terran Federation and demand our immediate withdrawal from this system." Laughter rippled across the bridge. The idea that some primitive species would issue ultimatums to the Vorthan Empire was absurd beyond belief. These Terrans clearly didn't understand what they were facing. "Their weapons?" Thane inquired, still amused by the alien's boldness. "Kinetic systems only, sir. No energy weapons detected. Their largest vessels appear to be mounting some form of magnetic acceleration cannon, but the power levels are minimal compared to our plasma arrays." Thane nodded, his tactical mind already formulating a response. These newcomers would learn the same lesson that every species eventually learned, that resistance to the Empire only delayed the inevitable and increased the final cost. Deploy Squadron 7 to intercept. Show them what happens when primitives challenge their betters. 20 of the Empire's finest warships broke formation and advanced toward the human fleet. Their graceful hulls gleamed with energy shields, while plasma cannons charged to full power. It would be a brief engagement, Thane was certain. The aliens would see their technological inferiority, retreat to hyperspace, and hopefully warn other species about the futility of opposing the Empire. On the bridge of the Valiant, Captain Torres watched the Vorthan squadron approach with the cold calculation that characterized human military leadership. Her tactical officer, Commander Hayes, provided a steady stream of analysis as their sensors gathered data on alien technology. 20 vessels, energy-based weapons, some form of defensive shielding, Hayes reported. Standard engagement range appears to be approximately 50,000 kilometers based on their approach pattern. Torres nodded. Human naval doctrine had been developed through centuries of warfare on a planet where long-range engagement usually meant you died before. Closing to effective range. Earth's oceans had taught humanity that survival meant getting close enough to guarantee your weapons would hit their targets. All ships close to minimum range, she ordered. Let them fire first. I want to see what we're dealing with. The Vorthan squadron opened fire at 40,000 kilometers, their plasma cannons sending streams of superheated matter toward the approaching human vessels. The energy beams struck the Valiant's armored hull with spectacular results, metal plating vaporizing, in brilliant flashes that lit up the void. But the ship didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. On the Dominion, Des stared at her sensors in disbelief. Sir, direct hits on the lead vessel, but they're still advancing. Damage appears minimal. Thane frowned. That was impossible. Their plasma weapons could punch through any known armor plating. Yet the primitive ship continued its approach, its hull scarred but intact. The other human vessels maintained formation, absorbing hit after hit without breaking off their attack run. Power levels? He demanded. Sir, their reactors are operating at maximum capacity, but they're not powering shields or return fire. All energy appears to be directed to propulsion and some form of magnetic field generators. At 15,000 kilometers, the human fleet finally returned fire. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Tungsten slugs accelerated to a significant percentage of light speed slammed into Vorthan vessels with the force of nuclear weapons. Ships that had survived dozens of battles simply disintegrated under the kinetic impact. The Vorthans had built their vessels for energy combat between civilized species. Their shields could deflect plasma and particle beams with ease, but they were useless against solid projectiles traveling at relativistic velocities. The elegant hull designs that looked so impressive in energy combat crumpled like paper under the brutal kinetic assault. Impossible, Thane whispered as he watched his squadron die. Ships that had taken years to build vanished in seconds, their crews vaporized by weapons that belonged in the archives of primitive warfare. But it was the human response to battle damage that truly shook him. Vorthan vessels would retreat when their shields failed or their weapons were damaged. It was basic tactical doctrine to preserve valuable ships and experienced crews. The humans did the opposite. When one of their vessels lost its main weapons, it simply rammed the nearest Vorthan ship, both vessels disappearing in a mutual annihilation that left debris spreading across thousands of kilometers. Sir, request for reinforcements from Squadron 7, his communications officer reported, his voice shaking. They report enemy vessels are continuing to fight after catastrophic damage. One ship lost its entire forward section, but continued firing with secondary weapons until reactor failure. Thane stood slowly, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. This wasn't warfare, as the Empire understood it. This was something primal and terrifying. Combat driven not by tactical considerations, but by pure, unrelenting aggression. In the space of 30 minutes, Squadron 7 ceased to exist. Of the 20 ships that had engaged the human fleet, nothing remained but expanding clouds of debris and radiation. The human losses were significant but not crippling. They had lost perhaps 8 vessels in exchange for the complete destruction of a Vorthon squadron. "Get me a communication channel to all ships," Thane ordered, his voice steady despite the shock of what he had witnessed. "All vessels are to maintain maximum distance from enemy forces. Do not engage at close range under any circumstances." As reports flooded in from across his fleet, Thane realized that the galaxy had just introduced him to something unprecedented. These Terrans didn't just fight differently, they fought with a brutality and determination that defied every principle of civilized warfare. He was no longer facing an inferior species that would crumble under superior technology. He was facing something that evolution had forged in the fires of a world that never stopped trying to kill its inhabitants. Something that had learned to wage war with the same relentless efficiency that their planet used to eliminate the weak. For the first time in his military career, Commander Thane felt afraid. High Counselor Lyra had given up hope 12 hours ago. The bombardment had stopped, but that only meant the Vorthons were preparing for the final ground assault that would eliminate the last pockets of Althari resistance. Her people huddled in the deepest shelters, waiting for death to find them in the darkness below their dying world. Then the explosions started again, but these were different. The impacts came from above, from orbit, but they weren't targeting Althari positions. Through the chaos of overlapping shock waves and electromagnetic interference, her communications officer managed to establish contact with a surviving observation post on the surface. "Counselor, you need to see this," Vel whispered, her voice filled with something Lyra hadn't heard in days. Hope. The grainy image that appeared on their emergency display showed the space above Thessia Prime transformed into a battlefield unlike anything in recorded galactic history. The elegant curves of Vorthon warships were locked in brutal combat with angular, scarred vessels that fought with a savagery that defied comprehension. As they watched, a human destroyer that had lost half. Its hull continued firing its remaining weapons while spinning out of control. Its final act was to detonate its reactor in the midst of a Vorthon formation, the nuclear fire consuming friend and foe alike. The Althari command staff stared in stunned silence at beings who fought with such commitment that death was simply another weapon to be wielded. "They came," Lyra breathed. "The Deathworlders actually came." Admiral Brooks coordinated the fleet action from his command ship, Indomitable, a massive dreadnought whose hull bore the scars of the initial engagement. His tactical display showed the evolving battle as human vessels pressed their attack against the Vorthan fleet with relentless determination. "Sir, General Murphy reports her Marines are ready for boarding operations," his aide reported. "She's requesting permission to begin assault pod launches." Brooks nodded grimly. The space battle was only part of the equation. The Vorthons had fortified themselves around Thessia Prime's orbital stations, using the massive structures as shields, while their ground forces completed the extermination below. Standard doctrine would call for a siege, slowly reducing the enemy positions over weeks or months. Humans didn't have weeks or months. The Althari were dying now, and every minute of delay meant more innocent lives lost. Earth's children had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to save someone was to charge straight into hell and drag them back out. "Launch all assault pods," Brooks ordered. "Tell Murphy she has full authorization for direct assault operations." What followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. 3,000 human Marines launched themselves at heavily defended enemy positions in small, minimally armored pods that relied on speed and surprise rather than protection. Half of them died in the first wave, their pods torn apart by defensive fire before they could reach their targets. The survivors did what humans had always done when faced with impossible odds. They adapted, improvised, and never gave up. Marines whose pods were damaged but still functional used them as kinetic weapons, ramming directly into Vorthon defensive positions. Those whose pods were destroyed in flight continued their assault in hard vacuum, using suit thrusters to reach enemy hull plating before cutting their way inside with plasma torches. Commander Thane watched in horror as his supposedly impregnable orbital fortress was systematically overrun by beings that seemed immune to the hazards of space combat. Human soldiers fought in hard vacuum as easily as they fought in atmosphere, their equipment designed for the simple assumption that any environment might become hostile without warning. "Sir, Marine incursion on Deck 7, his security chief reported. "They've breached the primary power conduits and are advancing toward the command section. Deploy the security teams," Thane ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. His soldiers were trained for combat against other civilized species, enemies that would retreat when faced with superior firepower or tactical disadvantage. These humans seemed to view casualties as simply the price of achieving their objectives. The fighting inside the orbital station was brutal and short. Vorthon soldiers, despite their advanced weapons and armor, found themselves outmatched by enemies who had learned to fight in environments that would kill most species instantly. Human Marines moved through the station's corridors like they owned them, their tactics born from centuries of urban warfare on a planet where every conflict was a struggle for survival. When the orbital stations fell, the Vorthon ground forces found themselves cut off from orbital support. Captain Torres coordinated with the surviving Althari resistance cells, providing targeting data for human orbital strikes, while evacuation transports began pulling civilian survivors from the underground shelters. General Murphy established her command post in the ruins of what had once been Thessia Prime's capital city. The destruction was staggering. Entire districts had been reduced to glowing craters by Vorthon plasma weapons. But among the devastation, her Marines found pockets of Althari survivors who had endured the impossible through sheer determination to live. "Get me a channel to all Vorthon ground commanders," Murphy ordered her communications specialist. When the connection was established, her message was simple and direct. "This is General Murphy of the Terran Colonial Marines. You have exactly 1 hour to surrender unconditionally. Anyone found harming civilians after that deadline will be treated as a war criminal. This is your only warning." The response came in the form of renewed attacks on Althari refugee columns. The Vorthons had apparently decided that if they couldn't complete their extermination mission, they would at least inflict maximum casualties before their inevitable defeat. It was a mistake that cost them everything. Human Marines who had been conducting measured advances suddenly shifted into a mode of warfare that terrified even their own command structure. Units that had been following standard tactical doctrine began moving with the ruthless efficiency of predators eliminating a threat to their pack. The Vorthon soldiers, trained in the civilized warfare of galactic empires, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with the desperation of a species that had clawed its way to the top of a food chain that never stopped trying to consume the weak. When ammunition ran low, humans used bayonets. When weapons failed, they used their hands. When surrounded and outnumbered, they called in airstrikes on their own positions rather than allow the enemy to escape. In orbit, Admiral Brooks coordinated the final phases of the operation while rescue ships ferried Althari survivors to safety. The battle was won, but the cost had been severe. Nearly a third of his fleet was destroyed or badly damaged, and the Marines had taken casualties that would have broken most military units. But they had saved a species from extinction, and that was what mattered. High Counselor Lyra emerged from her bunker to find human medics treating Althari wounded with the same desperate skill they used on their own people. These aliens who had crossed the galaxy to answer a distress call from strangers now worked side by side with her people, sharing medical supplies and offering comfort to the dying without regard for species or politics. As she watched a human Marine carefully carry an injured Althari child to a waiting medical transport, Lyra realized that her species had not just been saved. They had been introduced to something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had evolved past the point where survival was about individual or even tribal success. These Deathworlders had achieved something that evolution rarely produced: the ability to extend their protective instincts to encompass anyone who needed help, regardless of the cost to themselves. It was a trait born from millions of years on a planet where cooperation was the difference between life and death, where the strong survive by protecting the weak. The galaxy would never be the same. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the vast chambers of Nexus Station, a neutral facility that orbited between the territories of the galaxy's major powers. Representatives from 100 worlds materialized as holograms, or attended in person, their various forms reflecting the incredible diversity of spacefaring life. But today, all attention focused on the central display showing the aftermath of the Battle of Thessia Prime. Debris fields stretched across thousands of kilometers where the Vorthan fleet had met its end. Rescue ships bearing the crude, angular design of human vessels moved among the wreckage, pulling survivors from the void without regard for species or allegiance. Prime Speaker Dulac of the Hegemony Council spoke first, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's lights as he addressed the assembly. In 3 days, an unknown species has fundamentally altered the balance of power in this galaxy. The Vorthan Empire, which had conquered 17 systems in the past decade, has been completely destroyed by beings we know nothing about. Senator Korith of the Trade Federation, her tentacles writhing with obvious distress, projected tactical data for all to see. My military advisors inform me that these humans employ weapons and tactics that render our current defensive doctrines obsolete. They use kinetic weapons that our energy shields cannot deflect. Their ships are armored rather than shielded, making them nearly immune to plasma weapons, and their soldiers fight in hard vacuum as easily as they fight in atmosphere. A low murmur rippled through the assembly. Most galactic civilizations had evolved on worlds with stable climates and abundant resources. Their military technologies had developed along similar lines, focusing on energy-based weapons and defensive shields. The idea of deliberately designing equipment for hostile environments was foreign to their experience. Ambassador Zell of the Peaceful Worlds Coalition rose to address the chamber. The question before us is not merely military. These humans responded to a distress call from a species they had never met, traveling across galactic distances to prevent genocide. Their actions suggest either a level of altruism unknown in galactic politics or an expansion strategy more subtle than direct conquest. The debate that followed lasted for hours, but the underlying fear was obvious to everyone present. Humanity had demonstrated capabilities that threatened the established order of galactic civilization. Worse, they had done so not for conquest or resources, but apparently out of simple compassion for a dying species. On Thessia Prime, Admiral Brooks walked through the ruins of the planetary capital alongside High Counselor Lyra. Human engineers worked alongside Althari technicians to restore basic services, their equipment designed for the assumption that infrastructure might be destroyed without warning. Emergency shelters built from human military supplies dotted the landscape, providing temporary homes for the millions of refugees who had survived the Vorthan assault. "Your people are remarkable," Lyra said as they watched a human medical team treating Althari casualties. "They give their own medical supplies to strangers, share their food with those who cannot repay them. This level of cooperation between species, it is unprecedented." Brooks smiled grimly. "We learned a long time ago that survival often depends on helping others survive. On Earth, the greatest threats weren't always from competing human groups. Sometimes it was the environment itself, natural disasters that could only be overcome through cooperation." Species that couldn't work together didn't last long on our world. They paused beside a memorial being constructed for the human soldiers who had died in the liberation of Thessia Prime. The names came from every nation and ethnic group that had ever existed on Earth, united now in death as they had been in life by their commitment to protecting the innocent. "What happens now?" Lyra asked. "Will your people remain here, or return to your own worlds?" "We'll help you rebuild," Brooks replied without hesitation. "And we'll make sure the galaxy knows that the Althari are under human protection. Anyone who wants to finish what the Vorthons started will have to go through us first." News of humanity's intervention spread through galactic communication networks with unprecedented speed. Within days, similar distress calls began arriving at Earth from other species facing extinction or slavery. The small Telian Republic, threatened by corporate raiders. The mining colonies of the Outer Rim, facing annexation by the commercial syndicate. Dozens of minor civilizations that had survived by hiding in the galaxy's forgotten corners. Each call received the same response. Human fleets departed immediately, carrying with them the simple message that no one would face extinction, alone while Earth drew breath. The galaxy's predator species quickly learned to avoid systems under human protection, while smaller civilizations began actively seeking membership in what became known as the Terran Protection Compact. The formation of the Compact sent shockwaves through established galactic powers. Unlike traditional alliances based on mutual benefit or shared resources, the human-led coalition operated on principles that seemed to defy political logic. Member species contributed what they could, when they could, but protection was offered, regardless of their ability to provide military or economic support. Dr. Watson, now serving as Earth's first xenocultural ambassador, found herself in the unusual position of explaining human motivations to alien dignitaries who couldn't comprehend cooperation without immediate benefit. "You must understand," she told a gathering of hegemony officials. "Humans evolved as pack hunters on a world that actively tried to kill us. Our survival strategy has always been to form groups larger than the immediate threat, to include anyone willing to help defend the group." The hegemony's response came in the form of economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation. They pressured their allies to avoid contact with human vessels, hoping to contain what they saw as a dangerous infection of galactic stability. But their efforts backfired spectacularly when 3 hegemony member worlds quietly requested human protection from their own government's increasingly oppressive taxation policies. On the bridge of the newly constructed Defiance, Captain Torres reviewed intelligence reports from across known space. The galaxy was rapidly dividing into 2 camps, those who viewed humanity as a stabilizing force and those who saw them as a threat to the established order. Message from Admiral Brooks, her communications officer reported. "Intelligence suggests the Dominion fleet is mobilizing for action against our position in the Vega sector." Torres nodded. The Stellar Dominion had been one of the galaxy's major powers for over 1,000 years. Their empire built on the systematic conquest and assimilation of weaker species. The rapid expansion of human influence represented an existential threat to their entire worldview. "How many ships?" she asked. "Preliminary estimates suggest 800 vessels, including their newest dreadnoughts. Admiral Brooks is assembling the 5th and 7th fleets to respond, but we'll still be outnumbered 3-1. Torres smiled, the expression holding no warmth. "Tell the Admiral that the 3rd Fleet volunteers for the advance guard, and remind him that humans have never been particularly impressed by superior numbers." The message was simple, but it reflected a truth that the galaxy was slowly learning to understand. Humans had evolved on a world where being outnumbered was the normal state of affairs. Every major threat they had faced, from saber-toothed cats to natural disasters, had possessed advantages that should have guaranteed human extinction. Yet here they were, spreading across the galaxy with the same relentless determination that had carried them from the African savanna to the stars. In the depths of space, construction crews worked around the clock to build new shipyards and supply depots. Human industrial capacity, developed through centuries of warfare and environmental challenges, operated on principles that other species found incomprehensible. Rather than building elegant, efficient facilities, humans constructed redundant systems designed to continue operating under the worst possible conditions. The Battle of Vega Prime would come to define the new galactic order. When the Dominion fleet arrived expecting to face a small human force defending their newest protectorate, they instead found Admiral Brooks's combined fleets waiting in formation. The humans had learned from their first encounter with advanced alien technology, adapting their tactics to counter energy shields and plasma weapons. The engagement lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the Dominion fleet. But more importantly, it established the principle that would guide human expansion for generations to come. Anyone who threatened the innocent would face the full fury of Earth's children, regardless of their power or technology. As news of the victory spread, something unprecedented began happening across the galaxy. Species that had never met humans began incorporating Earth's protection symbols into their own defensive systems. The simple blue circle representing humanity's homeworld became a universal sign meaning protected in dozens of alien languages. High Counselor Lyra, now serving as the first non-human member of the Terran Protection Council, stood before the rebuilt Parliament of Thessia Prime as her people voted on a historic measure. The Althari had decided to dedicate their entire industrial capacity to supporting human rescue operations, transforming their peaceful civilization into the medical and engineering backbone of the growing alliance. "We do this not from obligation," she told the assembly, "but because we have learned what it means to be part of something larger than ourselves. The humans saved us not because we could offer them anything in return, but because they believe that every species has the right to exist. Now we help them extend that protection to others who face the darkness alone." The vote was unanimous. Within months, Althari medical ships would be responding to disasters across the galaxy alongside human rescue fleets. Their advanced healing technology combined with human determination to save lives at any cost. But perhaps the most significant change came not from military victories or diplomatic alliances, but from the simple example of human behavior. Species across the galaxy began questioning the assumptions that had governed their civilizations for millennia. Why should the strong prey upon the weak? Why should advanced civilizations ignore the suffering of those less fortunate? Why should survival be a competition rather than a cooperative effort? The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Many species, particularly those whose empires were built on exploitation, resisted the changing galactic order with increasing desperation. But their resistance only served to highlight the fundamental difference between humanity and the galaxy's traditional powers. Where other species saw survival as a zero-sum game, humans saw it as a team effort. Where others viewed different species as potential threats or resources, humans saw potential allies and friends. Where the galaxy had always operated on the principle that might makes right, humanity introduced the radical concept that right makes might. As Admiral Brooks stood on the observation deck of Earth's newest orbital station, watching the steady stream of ships carrying refugees from across the galaxy to safety, he reflected on how quickly everything had changed. Less than a year ago, humanity had been alone in the cosmos, focused on their own expansion and survival. Now they were the reluctant guardians of a growing coalition that spanned hundreds of worlds. The responsibility was staggering, but it was one that humans had been preparing for their entire evolutionary history. Every challenge that Earth had thrown at them, from ice ages to asteroid impacts, had taught them the same lesson. Survival meant adaptation, cooperation, and never giving up on those who couldn't protect themselves. The galaxy had called them Deathworlders, expecting to find savage monsters driven by primitive aggression. Instead, they found something far more dangerous to the established order, a species that had learned to extend their protective instincts beyond their own kind, backed by the industrial and military capacity to make those instincts a galactic reality. The age of exploitation was ending. The age of protection had begun. And at its heart stood the children of Earth, carrying with them the hard-learned lessons of a world that had forged them into something the galaxy had never seen before. Apex predators who hunted other apex predators, not for territory or resources, but for the simple right of the innocent to exist. The stars themselves seemed brighter now, illuminated by the hope that somewhere in the vast darkness, someone was always watching, always ready to answer the call when extinction came knocking. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The emergency lights bathed everything in red as the ship shook violently. Nala pressed her thin fingers against the communication panel, her heart racing faster than her species ever thought possible. Outside the viewport, the last of the Rilani, colonies burned in space. The void swarm had consumed everything in its path, leaving only empty husks where once thriving worlds had existed. "Send the message again," she whispered to her communications officer, Krim. "Someone has to hear us." Krim's 4 eyes blinked nervously as he adjusted the long-range transmitter. The Rilani had always prided themselves on being a peaceful people. Their technology focused on art, healing, and diplomatic relations with other species across the galaxy. They had no weapons, no armies, and no experience with the horrors now hunting them through space. The Void Swarm was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. These creatures appeared from the dark spaces between stars, consuming all biological matter they encountered. They were not just predators. They were a plague that grew stronger with every world they devoured. The peaceful Rilani had tried reasoning with them, offering gifts and knowledge, but the swarm only understood hunger. Nala watched as another colony ship exploded in the distance. Thousands of her people had been on that vessel, fleeing their homeworld in hopes of finding safety among the stars. Now they were gone, their life essence feeding the growing nightmare that pursued them. "The message is ready," Krim reported, his voice shaking, broadcasting on all known frequencies. The distress signal went out across the galaxy, carrying the desperate plea of a dying species. In the message, Nala begged for help from any civilization capable of fighting the swarm. She offered everything the Rilani possessed: their art, their knowledge, their eternal gratitude, in exchange for salvation from this cosmic horror. The signal reached the Zephyrian Empire first, but their council voted to seal their borders and wait for the threat to pass. The mechanical synthoids received the transmission but calculated that involvement would result in unacceptable losses. The wise elders of Proxima deemed the situation too dangerous for their young civilization to handle. One by one, the galaxy's great powers turned away from the Rilani plea. Some sent messages of sympathy, but none offered the military aid that Nala desperately needed. The civilized species of the galaxy had grown comfortable in their peace, unprepared for a threat that could not be negotiated with or reasoned away. But the signal traveled farther than anyone expected, reaching the forbidden edges of known space. In a small yellow star system that most galactic maps marked only as a warning, something heard the Rilani cry for help. Admiral Torres was reviewing supply reports when the communication alert sounded on the bridge of the Earth battleship Retribution. The human military officer looked up from his datapad, frowning at the unusual signal pattern appearing on the screens around him. "What is that?" he asked Lieutenant Davis, who was working at the communications station. "Unknown transmission, sir. It's coming from outside our system, but the universal translator is having trouble with it. The language structure is completely alien." Torres stood up, his interest growing. For 50 years, humanity had been isolated in their solar system, cut off from galactic civilization by an invisible barrier maintained by the other species. The official reason was protection. Earth was classified as a death world, too dangerous for normal life forms to visit. but Torres and every other human suspected the real reason was fear. "Play the message," he ordered, the alien voice filled, the bridge speaking in desperate tones that the translator struggled to interpret. Words and phrases flickered across the screens as the computer tried to make sense of the foreign language. "We demand tribute from weak species. Your worlds will feed our hunger. Send warriors or face total destruction." Torres felt his blood run cold as the translation continued. The message seemed to be a declaration of war, threatening Earth and demanding submission to some alien empire. The Admiral had always known this day would come, the day when the galaxy's other species would finally decide to eliminate the human threat. "Sir," Lieutenant Davis said nervously, "should we alert High Command?" "Yes," Torres replied grimly, "and start mobilizing the fleet. It looks like someone's finally decided to test the Deathworlders." The Admiral was wrong, of course. The Rilani message was a plea for help, not a threat of war. But the damaged translation made it sound like an ultimatum from a conquering alien force. The peaceful aliens who had sent the signal could never have imagined how their words would be twisted by the primitive human technology. Within hours, the Terran Defense Force was on high alert. Ships that had patrolled the edges of the solar system for decades began moving toward Earth, their crews preparing for the first interstellar war in human history. The military commanders who had spent years planning for this moment finally had their chance to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. Torres stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as 11 other dreadnoughts took formation around him. Each ship carried enough firepower to level a planet, crewed by soldiers who had trained their entire lives for combat. The humans had spent 50 years in isolation, building weapons and preparing for war while the rest of the galaxy enjoyed peace. "Set course for the signal source," Torres commanded, "and ready all weapons. If they want a war, we'll give them one they'll never forget." The human fleet jumped to hyperspace, carrying death toward a species that had only wanted to live. Behind them, Earth's automated systems continued trying to translate the alien message, slowly improving their understanding with each attempt. But by the time the computers finally decoded the Rilani's true plea for help, it would be too late. In the deep space between stars, the Void Swarm sensed the approach of new prey. The creatures had detected the massive life signatures of the human fleet, and their hunger grew stronger. Soon, they would have fresh worlds to devour and new species to consume. The swarm began moving toward the convergence point, drawn by the promise of the largest feeding in their existence. 3 species were now rushing toward the same star system, each with different goals and none understanding the others. The stage was set for a collision that would reshape the galaxy's future and reveal truths that had been hidden for far too long. The war room beneath Earth's surface buzzed with activity as generals and admirals gathered around the massive holographic display. The alien signal had been analyzed dozens of times, and each review only confirmed their worst fears. An advanced alien civilization was making demands, threatening humanity with destruction if they refused to surrender. General Park slammed her fist on the metal table, causing several coffee cups to rattle. 50 years we've waited for this. 50 years of being treated like animals in a cage while they decided our fate." Admiral Torres nodded grimly as he studied the fleet positions on the display. 12 of humanity's most powerful warships were already moving through hyperspace, carrying enough nuclear weapons to glass a dozen worlds. The ships had been designed with one purpose in mind, to prove that humanity belonged among the stars no matter what the galaxy's other species thought of them. "The translation software is still working on the message," reported Dr. Kim from the linguistics department. "But the meaning seems clear enough. They're demanding tribute and threatening invasion if we refuse." Torres looked at the recovered fragments of text scrolling across the screen. Words like feed, hunger, and destruction appeared repeatedly. painting a picture of a ruthless alien empire that viewed humans as nothing more than prey. The Admiral had read enough history to know what happened to civilizations that showed weakness in the face of such threats. "How long until our fleet reaches their system?" he asked. 18 hours, sir, Lieutenant Commander Walsh replied. The scout ships report no sign of enemy activity along the route, but they could be hiding behind their planets or moons. Meanwhile, in the Rilani system, hope flickered for the first time in weeks as massive energy signatures appeared on the long-range sensors. Nala felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she watched the readings that could only mean one thing. Someone had answered their call for help. "How many ships?" she asked her sensor officer, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. 12 major vessels, Captain. Each one is massive, easily the size of our largest colony ships. They're moving in perfect formation directly toward our system. Nala closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever gods might be listening. The galaxy had not abandoned them after all. Someone had heard their plea and was coming to help fight the Void Swarm. She could already imagine the celebration when their saviors arrived. The grateful speeches, the exchange of gifts, the beginning of a new alliance that would drive back the darkness threatening to consume everything. "Begin preparing the welcome ceremony," she ordered. "Gather all the surviving colony leaders. We need to show proper respect to whoever these brave souls are." The Rilani worked frantically to prepare for their guests, collecting examples of their finest art and cultural treasures to present as gifts. They composed songs of gratitude and prepared traditional foods, even though they had no idea what their rescuers might eat. The important thing was showing appreciation for the incredible risk these unknown heroes were taking on their behalf. But far from the Rilani homeworld, something else had noticed the approaching energy signatures. The Void Swarm had been feeding on the outer colonies for weeks, growing larger and more intelligent with each world they consumed. Their collective consciousness could sense the massive life forms approaching the system, more food than they had encountered in centuries of hunting. The swarm began to change, reshaping itself for the largest feeding in its existence. Individual creatures merged into larger forms, creating bioships capable of space travel and combat. Their hunger was overwhelming now, driving them toward the convergence point where 3 species would soon meet. Back on Earth, the final preparations for war were underway. Factories worked around the clock to produce ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement parts for the fleet. Military hospitals prepared for the wounded that were sure to return from humanity's first interstellar battle. Families said goodbye to soldiers who might never come home. Admiral Torres made his final inspection of the Retribution, walking through corridors filled with young men and women who had volunteered to fight for their species' survival. These soldiers had been trained from childhood to be harder, faster, and more resilient than any enemy they might face. They carried weapons that could punch through starship armor and wore protective suits that could keep them fighting even in the vacuum of space. "Remember," Torres told his officers during the final briefing, "we don't know what we're facing out there. The aliens who sent that message might have technology we've never seen before. But we have something they don't understand: the will to fight when fighting seems impossible." The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Rilani system, sensors immediately scanning for threats. What they found confused them. The system showed signs of recent destruction, with debris fields marking the locations of destroyed worlds. But there were no massive alien warships, no obvious military formations waiting to attack them. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, "I'm detecting several small vessels near the 4th planet. They appear to be civilian ships, possibly refugees." Torres frowned at the display. This didn't match the intelligence reports at all. Where was the vast alien empire that had threatened Earth? Where were the military forces that had demanded humanity's surrender? "Could be a trap," suggested Commander Blake. They might be using civilian ships as cover for their real fleet. On the Rilani flagship, Nala watched the human ships with growing excitement. They were beautiful vessels, sleek and powerful, clearly built by an advanced civilization. She had no idea they were warships designed for planetary bombardment. To her eyes, they looked like the rescue fleet she had prayed for. "Open communications," she ordered. "Let's welcome our saviors properly." The Rilani transmission reached. The human fleet, but once again the translation software failed to interpret the alien language correctly. Where Nala spoke words of gratitude and welcome, the computers heard aggressive challenges and demands for immediate surrender. Admiral Torres felt his suspicions confirmed as the alien message played on the bridge. These creatures were trying to intimidate him, using civilian ships as human shields while making threats. It was exactly the kind of cowardly tactic he would expect from a species that preyed on the weak. "All ships, battle stations," he commanded. "Prepare to engage enemy forces." The human fleet moved into attack formation, weapons charging and targeting systems locking onto the Rilani vessels. Neither species understood what was about to happen. The humans believed they were facing a treacherous enemy that had threatened their homeworld. The Rilani thought they were about to celebrate their rescue from extinction. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the Void Swarm felt the massive concentration of life energy building in the system. The feeding would begin soon, and when it was over, 3 species would be forever changed by what they discovered about themselves and each other. The countdown to first contact had begun, but it would not unfold as anyone expected. The silence between the stars was shattered by the roar of human weapons. Admiral Torres watched from his command chair as 12 dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously, their massive cannons sending streams of superheated plasma toward the Rilani vessels. The first salvo was meant to be a warning shot, a demonstration of human firepower to discourage further aggression. But the Rilani ships were not built for war. Their hulls were designed for comfort and efficiency, not combat. The plasma beams tore through the diplomatic vessels like paper, vaporizing 3 ships instantly and crippling 2 others. In the space of 30 seconds, over 1,000 peaceful aliens died in the cold vacuum of space. Nala felt her world collapse as she watched her people's ships explode around her. The beautiful vessels she had thought were saviors had just committed mass murder without warning or provocation. Her hands shook as she tried to understand what was happening. "All ships, cease fire!" Torres shouted as he realized something was terribly wrong. The alien vessels had made no attempt to defend themselves. They had no shields, no weapons, and no armor. "These were not warships at all, sir," Lieutenant Davis reported, his voice filled with horror. "Those were civilian transports, the life sign readings. There were families on those ships, children." The Admiral felt sick as the truth began to dawn on him. The translation software had failed them catastrophically. These were not conquerors or enemies. They were refugees fleeing from something that had already destroyed their worlds. Humanity had just attacked the very people they should have been protecting. Commander Blake stared at the tactical display, watching the debris from the destroyed ships drift through space. "What have we done?" he whispered. Before Torres could respond, new contacts appeared on the sensors. The surviving Rilani ships were broadcasting frantically on all frequencies, their messages now clearly translated as desperate pleas for mercy. Nala's voice filled the human bridge, speaking in broken but understandable English. "Please, we surrender. We mean no harm. We only asked for help against the swarm. Why are you killing us?" The words hit Torres like a physical blow. Help against the swarm. They had been asking for help, not making threats. The universal translator had turned a plea for assistance into a declaration of war, and now innocent beings were dead because of human paranoia and aggression. "Stand down all weapons," Torres ordered quietly. "Prepare boarding shuttles. We need to get medical teams over to those damaged ships immediately." But even as the humans tried to correct their mistake, something else was stirring in the darkness beyond the system's outer edge. The void swarm had felt the sudden deaths, the massive release of life energy from the destroyed ships. The taste of fear and pain that filled the space around the battle zone was intoxicating to creatures that fed on biological matter. The first swarm scouts entered the system like shadows, their organic hulls nearly invisible against the star field. They had evolved to hunt peaceful civilizations, species that knew only cooperation and harmony. The sudden violence between the humans and Rilani was unlike anything they had encountered before. Human Marines boarded the damaged Rilani vessels, their heavy combat gear making them look like mechanical nightmares to the terrified aliens. But instead of weapons, they carried medical supplies and rescue equipment. The soldiers who had trained for war found themselves trying to save the lives of beings they had accidentally condemned to death. Sergeant Miller was the first human to see a living Rilani up close. The alien was trapped under debris in a collapsed corridor, her large eyes filled with pain and confusion. She was no larger than a human child, with thin limbs and delicate features that made her seem impossibly fragile. "Hey, it's okay," Miller said softly, setting down his rifle and reaching for his medical kit. "We're here to help now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about what happened." The Rilani female, Miller learned her name was Vera, looked up at the armored human with wonder rather than fear. She had never seen a being that could function normally while wearing such heavy equipment. On her world, the environmental suits used for dangerous work were barely heavier than clothing. "You are very strong," she whispered, as Miller lifted the debris off her injured leg with one hand. "Are all of your people like this?" Miller realized she was talking about something he took for granted. The gravity on human ships was set to Earth normal, which was apparently much higher than what the Rilani were used to. What felt natural to him was like living in a crushing weight to her species. Throughout the damaged ships, similar scenes played out as human medics tried to save alien lives. The soldiers discovered that the Rilani were incredibly vulnerable compared to humans. Their bones were light and brittle, their skin thin enough to cut on sharp edges that would barely scratch human flesh. They required carefully controlled environments and could not survive the temperature changes that humans adapted to easily. "No wonder they needed help," muttered Corporal Ryan as he carefully carried a wounded Rilani to the medical bay. "How do they survive in space at all?" On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Torres was trying to understand the full scope of the disaster. The aliens had been fleeing from something called the Void Swarm, a species that consumed all biological matter in its path. The Rilani had sent out a distress call begging for military assistance, but the human translation computers had interpreted it as a threat. "Sir," the communications officer called out urgently, "we're getting massive sensor readings from the outer system. Something big is coming this way." Torres looked at the tactical display and felt his blood run cold. Dozens of large objects were moving toward them at incredible speed, their energy signatures unlike anything in the human databases. These were not ships in any traditional sense. They were living creatures the size of battleships, and they were heading straight for the convergence of human and Rilani forces. "The swarm," whispered Captain Nala, who had been brought aboard the Retribution for medical treatment. "They have found us again. They always find us." The alien captain looked at Torres with eyes full of despair. "Your ships are powerful, but the swarm cannot be reasoned with. They exist only to feed, to grow, to consume everything that lives. They will devour your people just as they devoured mine." Torres studied the approaching contacts and made a decision that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. They had made a terrible mistake in attacking the Rilani, but they could still make it right. The humans had come here believing they were defending Earth from invasion. Now they would stay to defend innocent people from extinction. "All ships prepare for combat," he announced to the fleet. "We're about to face an enemy that wants to destroy everything we've ever cared about. Show them what happens when they threaten the innocent." The first swarm bioships entered weapon range just as the human fleet completed its battle formation. These creatures had fed on hundreds of worlds, absorbing the knowledge and technology of every species they consumed. They expected to find another group of peaceful civilizations ready to be harvested. Instead, they found something they had never encountered before, a species that had evolved to fight impossible odds and never surrender. The Void Swarm was about to learn what it meant to face creatures from a death world, beings who treated warfare not as a last resort, but as a way of life. The real battle was about to begin. The first bioship emerged from the darkness like a nightmare made real. It was over 2 kilometers long, its surface covered in writhing tentacles and organic weapons that pulsed with bioluminescent light. The creature's hull was not metal or ceramic but living tissue, constantly adapting and healing as it moved through space. Admiral Torres had fought in dozens of war simulations, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a living starship that radiated pure hunger. The bioship's surface rippled as it detected the concentration of life forms in the system, and dozens of smaller creatures began launching from openings that looked disturbingly like mouths. "All weapons, target the lead bioship," Torres commanded. "Show them what human engineering can do." The Retribution opened fire first, its main cannon sending a barrage of nuclear-tipped missiles toward the organic vessel. The humans watched in amazement as the bioship's surface changed color and texture, absorbing most of the explosive energy and converting it into fuel for its own systems. What should have been a crippling blow barely slowed the creature down. "Impossible," breathed Commander Blake. "It's eating our weapons." But Torres noticed something the others had missed. While the bioship had absorbed the nuclear energy, the kinetic impact had caused visible damage to its hull. The creature could adapt to energy weapons, but it still followed the basic laws of physics. "Switch to kinetic rounds," he ordered. "High-velocity tungsten penetrators. Let's see how it handles good old-fashioned momentum." The human fleet adjusted its tactics, firing solid projectiles at incredible speeds toward the approaching bioships. These rounds tore through the organic hulls like bullets through flesh, causing real damage that the creatures could not simply absorb. Dark fluid sprayed from the wounds, blood or some alien equivalent, and the bioships began to move more erratically. Captain Nala watched the battle from the Retribution's bridge, her large eyes wide with disbelief. The humans were actually hurting the swarm, something her people had thought impossible. The Raylani had tried energy weapons, plasma cannons, and even antimatter bombs, but nothing had been able to pierce the bioship's adaptive defenses. "How are you doing this?" she asked Torres. "We threw everything we had at them, but they just kept coming." Torres glanced at the alien captain and realized she was seeing something her species had never developed: the human talent for finding new ways to kill things. "We learned a long time ago that if one weapon doesn't work, you try another. And if that doesn't work, you get creative." The swarm was learning too. The bioships began deploying clouds of smaller organisms, creating a living shield that absorbed the kinetic rounds before they could reach the main vessels. But the humans adapted faster, switching to cluster munitions that scattered thousands of smaller projectiles through the defensive clouds. It was then that the true horror of the Void Swarm revealed itself. The smaller organisms that had been destroyed by human weapons did not simply die. They merged with the debris and began to grow. Within minutes, new bioships were forming from the wreckage of the old ones, fed by the matter they had consumed. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Davis, "the enemy is using our own ammunition to create new ships. Every round we fire is making them stronger." Torres felt a chill run down his spine. They were facing an enemy that could turn their own weapons against them, growing larger and more powerful with every attack. This was not a battle they could win through superior firepower alone, but humanity had not survived on a death world by giving up when things looked impossible. They had learned to fight dirty, to use every advantage they could find, and to never stop looking for weaknesses in their enemies. "Launch the boarding pods," Torres ordered, surprising everyone on the bridge. "Sir?" Commander Blake looked at him in shock. "You want to send our people inside those things?" "The bioships are healing from external damage," Torres explained, his mind working through the tactical possibilities. "But what happens if we attack them from the inside? Living tissue can't be as strong as armor plating." The human Marines who volunteered for the boarding mission were equipped with weapons their enemies had never faced before. Flamethrowers, filled with napalm, explosive charges designed to work in zero atmosphere, and combat knives made from materials that could cut through almost any organic substance. Sergeant Miller led the first boarding party into the belly of a bioship, cutting through its outer hull with a plasma torch. What they found inside was beyond their worst nightmares. Corridors made of living tissue that tried to digest anything that entered them, walls that moved to trap intruders, and defensive organisms that were part antibody and part killing machine. But the Marines had trained for combat in the most hostile environments Earth could provide. They wore sealed armor that protected them from biological attacks, carried weapons that could function in any atmosphere, and most importantly, they had been taught never to show fear in the face of the impossible. "This place is trying to eat us," reported Corporal Ryan over the radio as he fired his flamethrower at a wall that was attempting to close around his squad. "Then we eat it first," Miller replied, planting explosive charges along what appeared to be a major nerve cluster. "Remember, boys, we're the apex predators here." The explosions that followed shook the entire bioship as its nervous system was severed in multiple locations. The creature's movements became erratic, and it began attacking its own escort vessels, in confusion. For the first time since the battle began, a swarm bioship was truly hurt. Captain Nala watched in amazement as human boarding parties tore through the bioships from within, using tactics that her peaceful people could never have conceived. The humans fought like the living tissue was trying to fight back, adapting to every defense the creatures could deploy. "Your people are insane," she told Torres, but there was admiration in her voice rather than horror. "We prefer to think of ourselves as creative," Torres replied, watching as another bioship began to break apart under the assault of his Marines. "When you're from a world where everything wants to kill you, you learn to fight back against impossible odds." But the Void Swarm was learning too. The larger bioships began to retreat, using their smaller escorts as shields while they analyzed the human attack patterns. These creatures had consumed the knowledge of hundreds of species, and they were beginning to understand that they faced something genuinely dangerous for the first time in their existence. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since the war started, the Rilani began to believe they might actually survive. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they were proving that some prey fought back harder than any predator could handle. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you threatened a species that had evolved to never give up, no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. The age of easy hunting was over. The age of the Deathworlders had begun. The final phase of the battle began when Admiral Torres made a decision that horrified the Rilani and puzzled the Void Swarm. He ordered his damaged ships to ram directly into the largest biovessels, their crews evacuating at the last possible second while the ship's nuclear reactors were set to overload. "This is madness," Captain Nala whispered, as she watched human vessels sacrifice themselves in controlled explosions that tore massive holes in the enemy fleet. "Your people are destroying their own ships." Torres looked at the alien captain with grim satisfaction. "Sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything. The swarm thinks we're just another food source, but they're about to learn what it means to fight a species that evolved from predators." The kamikaze attacks caught the swarm completely off guard. In millions of years of hunting, they had never encountered a species willing to destroy their own resources to deny them to the enemy. The bioships tried to retreat from the suicidal human vessels, but Torres had anticipated this reaction. "Deploy the minefield," he commanded. Hidden throughout the system were thousands of nuclear mines that had been dropped by human scout ships during their approach. As the bioships tried to flee, they triggered the weapons, creating a chain reaction of explosions that lit up the darkness like a new star. The mines had been positioned to channel the surviving swarm forces toward a single escape route, a route that led directly into the guns of the waiting human fleet. Sergeant Miller and his Marines were still inside one of the bioships when the final assault began. The creature was dying around them, its systems failing as the human boarding parties systematically destroyed every major organ they could find. But Miller had discovered something that would change the course of the war. "Sir," he reported over the radio, "I've found what looks like a central brain. It's huge, and it's connected to every other bioship in the fleet. I think this is how they coordinate their attacks." Torres understood immediately. The swarm was not just a collection of individual creatures. It was a single organism spread across multiple bodies. If they could sever the neural connections between the bioships, the entire fleet would collapse. "Plant every explosive you have," Torres ordered, "and get out of there fast." But Miller had a better idea. Instead of just destroying the brain, he used his combat knife to cut samples of the neural tissue. If the humans could understand how the swarm's collective consciousness worked, they might be able to use it against other bioship fleets. The explosion that followed when Miller's charges detonated was visible from 3 star systems away. The central bioship collapsed in on itself as its nervous system was destroyed, and every other creature in the swarm fleet began to behave erratically. Without their guiding intelligence, the bioships started attacking each other, consuming their own kind in a feeding frenzy that destroyed them more effectively than any human weapon could have. Captain Nala watched in amazement as the seemingly unstoppable void swarm tore itself apart. In less than 6 hours, the humans had accomplished what her entire civilization had failed to do in months of desperate fighting. They had not just defeated the swarm, they had turned its own nature against itself. "How did you know that would work?" she asked Torres as the last bioship died in space. "We didn't," Torres admitted. "But humans have a saying. When you're fighting for survival, you try everything until something works. We've been doing it for thousands of years." The cleanup took 3 days. Human salvage teams worked alongside Rilani survivors to recover what they could from the wreckage, while the fleet's scientists analyzed the bioship remains to understand how the swarm had evolved. What they discovered changed humanity's understanding of their place in the galaxy. The void swarm had consumed over 200 civilizations during its existence, absorbing their knowledge and technology while leaving nothing behind but empty worlds. The neural tissue samples that Miller had recovered contained the memories of countless species, peaceful beings who had tried diplomacy, trade, and negotiation to stop the creatures that were devouring their homes. None of them had tried violence, on the scale that humans considered routine. Dr. Kim studied the recovered data with growing amazement. "These civilizations had technologies we can barely understand," she reported to Torres. "Faster-than-light communication, matter conversion, even some form of time manipulation. But they never developed effective weapons because they never needed them." Torres nodded slowly as he began to understand the implications. Humanity had been isolated not because they were too dangerous to contact, but because they were the galaxy's only hope against threats that peaceful species could not handle. The other civilizations had been protecting themselves from human violence while unknowingly condemning themselves to extinction when real predators appeared. "Send a message to Earth," Torres ordered. "Tell them we're no longer in quarantine, and start preparing diplomatic packages for every major civilization in the galaxy. They're going to need to hear this." The message that the Rilani sent across, the galaxy was very different from their first desperate plea for help. This time, they spoke of salvation at the hands of the Deathworlders, of a species so adapted to conflict that they could defeat enemies that had seemed unstoppable. Within weeks, the first diplomatic vessels began arriving at the edge of human space. The Zephyrian Empire, which had ignored the Relani distress call, now begged for human military advisors to help defend their colonies. The mechanical synthoids offered technology exchanges in return for human protection against biological threats. Even the ancient elders of Proxima requested meetings to discuss mutual defense agreements. But Torres insisted that any alliance would be on human terms. The galaxy had kept humanity isolated for 50 years, treating them like dangerous animals. Now that the other species needed human help, they would have to accept that the Deathworlders were equal partners in any agreement, not just hired killers to be used and discarded. Captain Nala became the first alien ambassador to Earth, working to establish formal relations between humanity and the galactic community. She often found herself translating not just languages but entire ways of thinking between species that had evolved under completely different circumstances. "Your people frighten them," she told Torres during one of their regular meetings. "They understand now that humanity could have conquered the galaxy centuries ago if you had wanted to. The fact that you stayed in your own system by choice makes them wonder what you were preparing for." Torres smiled grimly as he looked out at the stars through his office window. Earth was no longer alone in the darkness, but he knew that humanity's real work was just beginning. The Void Swarm had been just one threat among many that the peaceful species could not handle on their own. "Tell them we weren't preparing for conquest," he said. "We were preparing to protect what matters, and now we have a lot more to protect than just Earth." The first joint human-alien military base was established in the Relani system, with human Marines training alongside alien security forces. The differences between the species became apparent immediately, where the aliens focused on non-violent conflict resolution and defensive strategies. The humans taught aggressive tactics and overwhelming force projection. Sergeant Miller, now promoted to lieutenant for his actions during the swarm battle, found himself instructing a class of young Relani recruits in basic combat techniques. The aliens struggled with concepts that human children learned naturally: how to fight when outnumbered, how to use the environment as a weapon, how to keep fighting even when seriously injured. "Remember," Miller told his students as they practiced with training weapons, "your enemy won't stop just because you ask nicely. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to hurt the bad guys worse than they can hurt you." One of the Relani recruits, a female named Kira, raised her hand nervously. "But what if we become like the swarm? What if fighting makes us into monsters?" Miller considered the question carefully before answering. It was something every human soldier had to face eventually: the knowledge that the capacity for violence that made them effective protectors also made them potentially dangerous to those they served. "That's why we have rules," he said finally. "We fight to protect, not to destroy. We use only as much force as necessary, and we never forget that. Our job is to make sure good people can live in peace. The moment we start fighting for any other reason, we become the enemy." The lessons worked both ways. Human diplomats learned from the Relani about peaceful conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity. The aliens had developed sophisticated techniques for preventing wars before they started, skills that could be invaluable in managing humanity's new role as the galaxy's protectors. Admiral Torres found himself appointed as the first Director of Interspecies Defense, a position that made him responsible for coordinating military responses to threats across dozens of star systems. It was a job that required him to think beyond human tactical doctrine and consider the needs of species with completely different capabilities and limitations. The first test of the new alliance came 6 months later, when deep space sensors detected another bioship fleet approaching the Outer Rim territories. This time, the response was swift and coordinated. Human strike forces moved to intercept the threat, while alien evacuation fleets prepared to move civilian populations to safety. The battle was over in hours rather than days. The second swarm fleet never had a chance to adapt to human tactics because humanity had learned from the first encounter. Nuclear mines channeled the bioships into kill zones where kinetic weapons tore them apart before they could begin their feeding process. But the real victory was not military. It was the fact that dozens of different species had worked together to achieve it. Human ships carried alien scientists who analyzed the bioship weaknesses in real time. Rilani communications specialists coordinated fleet movements across multiple star systems. Mechanical synthoids provided technical support that kept human weapons functioning at peak efficiency. The galaxy was learning to fight back, and humanity was teaching them how. Captain Nala stood on the observation deck of the Joint Command Station, watching human and alien crew members work side by side to monitor the outer reaches of known space. The sight would have been impossible just a year earlier when the quarantine. Barriers still separated humanity from the rest of galactic civilization. "Do you think we've done the right thing?" she asked Torres, who had joined her at the viewport. "Bringing your people into the galaxy, I mean. There are still some who believe humans are too dangerous to trust with this much power." Torres was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the billions of beings who now lived under the protection of human weapons and human soldiers. The responsibility was enormous, and he knew that humanity would be judged by how they used the trust that had been placed in them. "Ask me again in 100 years, he said finally. "Right now, we're still figuring out what it means to be the galaxy's guardians. But I can promise you one thing. As long as there are innocent people who need protection, humanity will be there to provide it. That's what Deathworlders do." In the depths of space, automated monitoring stations scanned the darkness for signs of new threats. The Void Swarm had been defeated, but the galaxy was vast and full of dangers that peaceful civilizations could not handle alone. When those threats emerged, they would find something waiting for them that they had never encountered before. A species that had evolved to fight impossible odds and never surrender. The age of easy predation was over. The Deathworlders had ascended to their rightful place as protectors of the innocent, and they would hold that position no matter what. The universe threw at them. Humanity had finally found its purpose among the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same.